The parched August wind blew dust and despair across the frontier town of Laramie, Wyoming Territory, 1875, when Delilah Newcomb stumbled from the stagecoach, her face gaunt with hunger and her eyes vacant of the light that once made them shimmer like the mountain lakes she'd read about in books. She clutched a small leather satchel, the sole remnant of her former life, while her free hand instinctively touched the locket at her throat. The cool metal offering little comfort against the burning reality of all she had lost. Laramie wasn't much to look at: a dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, some freshly painted, others weathered by the relentless Wyoming elements. A general store, the Silver Dollar Saloon, Wilcox's boarding house, and the telegraph office formed the beating heart of a town that sat at the crossroads of civilization and wilderness. Delilah hadn't chosen Laramie. It was simply the farthest her meager funds could carry her from the ashes of her past. "End of the line, madam," the stagecoach driver called, already unloading the luggage of the other passengers, a traveling salesman and an elderly couple returning from visiting relatives back east. Delilah nodded mutely, her throat too parched and her spirit too broken to form words. 3 days of hard travel had left her dizzy, the world tilting dangerously as she took a step forward. The boardwalk rose to meet her, and she braced herself for the impact that never came. "Whoa there," a deep voice rumbled as strong hands caught her by the shoulders. "Steady now." She looked up into the sun-browned face of a tall man, his eyes the color of a summer sky beneath the brim of a well-worn hat. Dust clung to his denim trousers and faded blue shirt, and a star-shaped badge gleamed on his chest. "I'm fine," she managed, pulling away from his steadying grip. The last thing she needed was the attention of the local law. She'd come to Laramie to disappear, not to be noticed. Sheriff Daniel Vaughn studied the woman before him with concern etched across his weathered features. In his 15 years of keeping the peace in Laramie, he'd seen his share of desperate souls arrive on the frontier, but something about this one struck him differently. She was clearly educated, her speech refined despite her exhaustion, and beneath the layer of travel dust and obvious hunger, he could see she'd once known comfort. "Madam, you look like you could use some assistance," he said, keeping his voice gentle, the way he might approach a spooked horse. "Is someone meeting you?" Delilah straightened her spine, summoning what little dignity remained in her empty stomach and threadbare clothes. "No, sir. I require no assistance. I merely need directions to the cheapest lodging in town." Daniel frowned. The cheapest lodging in Laramie was the room above the livery stable that Jeb Saunders rented out, and it was no place for a lady. "Wilcox's boarding house is just down the way," he said instead. "Mrs. Wilcox is fair with her rates." "I appreciate the suggestion, Sheriff," but her words faltered as another wave of dizziness washed over her. "Miss Newcomb, Delilah Newcomb. Miss Newcomb, when did you last eat?" The question hung between them, and Delilah's pride warred with her practical nature. "Yesterday morning," she finally admitted. "A biscuit." Daniel nodded, his decision made. "My office is just across the street. I've got a pot of soup warming on the stove. Nothing fancy, but it's hot and there's plenty. After you've eaten, I'll walk you to the boarding house myself." "I couldn't possibly. It's my duty to look after folks in this town," he interrupted, "whether they've been here 15 years or 15 minutes. And you, Miss Newcomb, look like you might blow away in the next strong wind." Too weak to argue further, Delilah allowed herself to be guided across the rutted dirt street to a small but tidy office with "Sheriff" painted in bold letters across the door. Inside, the scent of beef and vegetables simmering on a pot-bellied stove made her empty stomach clench painfully. The office was simply furnished: a desk covered in papers, a gun rack on the wall, a row of cells in the back, mercifully empty at present. Daniel Vaughn gestured to a straight-backed wooden chair beside a smaller table. "Sit," he said, the command softened by his tone. He ladled steaming soup into a blue enamel bowl and placed it before her with a chunk of bread. "Eat slowly, or it'll come right back up." Delilah stared at the food, her hands trembling as she picked up the spoon. The first spoonful was heaven-rich broth with tender bits of beef and vegetables that spoke of care in preparation. She hadn't expected such domestic skill from a lawman. "This is delicious," she murmured after several careful bites. "Did you make it yourself?" Daniel's weathered face creased in a smile that transformed him from intimidating to almost boyish. "I did. Man can't survive on Mrs. Wilcox's cooking alone, good as it is. Had to learn to fend for myself after Ma died." Delilah nodded, focusing on her soup to avoid revealing how his simple kindness threatened to unravel her carefully constructed composure. She'd come west hardened against human connection, determined to rely only on herself after the betrayals she'd endured. "You're a long way from home," Daniel observed, not a question but a statement of fact as he settled behind his desk, giving her space. "I have no home," Delilah replied flatly, staring into her bowl. "Not anymore." Daniel didn't press. He'd seen enough tragedy to recognize its shadow. "We all come from somewhere," he said simply. "And we all end up somewhere else. What matters is what we do in between." Delilah looked up, surprised by the unexpected philosophy from the frontier lawman. "And what is it you think I should do, Sheriff Vaughn?" "Heal," he said, meeting her gaze steadily. "We heal. All of us carry wounds, Miss Newcomb. The visible ones are just the beginning." Something in his words, their quiet certainty, perhaps, or the use of we instead of you, pierced the armor around Delilah's heart. For the first time since the fire that had claimed her family home and her father's life 3 months ago, she felt tears threatening. She blinked them away, focusing on finishing her soup. She wouldn't break, not here, not in front of a stranger, no matter how kind. "Thank you for the meal," she said formally when she'd finished, rising on steadier legs. "If you could direct me to Mrs. Wilcox's establishment, I'll trouble you no further." Daniel Vaughn rose as well, reaching for his hat. "No trouble at all. I'll walk you there myself." His tone brooked no argument. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Laramie's Main Street. The town was coming to life as the workday ended, men emerging from the assayer's office and the bank, ranch hands riding in for evening entertainment, shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks. "Laramie's growing," Daniel commented as they walked. "Railroad came through in '68, changed everything. We get all types now, good and bad." "And which am I, Sheriff?" Delilah couldn't help asking, a spark of her old spirit flaring briefly. Daniel glanced down at her, something like appreciation in his eyes at her challenge. "That remains to be seen, Miss Newcomb, though I'd wager on the former." The Wilcox boarding house stood 3 doors down from the general store, a 2-story white clapboard structure with green shutters, and a wide front porch adorned with potted geraniums. As they approached, a plump woman with silver-streaked dark hair emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sheriff Vaughn," she called, her sharp eyes taking in Delilah with unconcealed curiosity. "Who's this you've brought me?" "Mrs. Wilcox, this is Miss Delilah Newcomb. She's just arrived on the afternoon stage and needs lodging." Martha Wilcox studied Delilah with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every type of traveler. "I've got 1 room left, 2nd floor back. $5 a week, includes breakfast and supper." Delilah's heart sank. It was more than she could afford for long. "I was hoping for something less dear." Mrs. Wilcox's expression didn't change. $3 a week if you help with laundry and mending. I've got more shirts and linens than time these days." Relief washed through Delilah. "I accept. I'm quite skilled with a needle." "Good. I'll show you up." Mrs. Wilcox turned to go inside, then paused. "Supper's at 6 sharp. Don't be late or you'll go hungry till breakfast." As the landlady disappeared inside, Delilah turned to Daniel. "Thank you, Sheriff, for everything." "Daniel," he corrected. "Most folks call me Daniel except when I'm enforcing the law." He hesitated, then added, "Whatever drove you here, Miss Newcomb, Laramie can be a fresh start. It has been for many." "Delilah," she replied softly, "and I hope you're right." Daniel tipped his hat and turned to go, then paused. "I make that soup every Sunday. More than I can eat alone. You'd be welcome to join me, should you find yourself with nothing better to do." Before she could respond, he was striding away, his tall figure cutting a distinctive path through the growing evening crowd. Delilah watched him go, conflicting emotions battling within her. She'd come to Laramie to hide, to nurse her wounds in private, to trust no one after the devastating betrayal that had cost her everything. Yet the simple kindness of soup and 4 words, "We heal," he'd said, had already begun to work a subtle change in her resolute isolation. With a deep breath, she stepped into the boarding house, where Mrs. Wilcox waited impatiently at the foot of the stairs, ready to show her to the room that would become her new beginning. The room at Wilcox's boarding house was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand with a blue and white china basin, a battered chest of drawers, and a small window overlooking the back garden. After 3 months of grief and uncertain travels, even this modest space felt like luxury to Delilah. "Bathrooms down the hall," Mrs. Wilcox said briskly. "Hot water on Wednesdays and Saturdays only, unless you heat it yourself. No gentlemen callers in the rooms. No liquor. No coming in after 10 o'clock. Break the rules and you're out, no refund." "I understand," Delilah said, setting her satchel on the bed. "When would you like me to begin with the laundry?" "Tomorrow morning after breakfast. 6 other boarders at present, 4 men, 2 women, all respectable." Mrs. Wilcox's expression suggested this last quality was non-negotiable. "I'll leave you to settle in. Supper bell rings at 6. Alone at last, Delilah sank onto the bed, her body aching from days of travel. She allowed herself 5 minutes of rest, staring at the ceiling before practicality asserted itself. She needed work. The laundry arrangement would cover her lodging, but she still needed to eat and save enough to. To what? She wasn't sure what came next. Survival had consumed her every thought since the night her world burned down. She unpacked her meager belongings. 2 dresses besides the one she wore, both showing signs of hasty mending, undergarments, a hairbrush, a small sewing kit, a worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, and wrapped carefully in a piece of velvet, a delicate silver pocket watch that had been her father's. The latter she couldn't bear to sell, though its value would have eased her journey west considerably. Last came a small leather-bound journal and a pencil. She'd started recording her thoughts during the journey west, trying to make sense of how rapidly her life had changed. The daughter of a respected Boston banker, she'd gone from a life of comfort to destitution in the space of one terrible night. Delilah unwrapped the watch, running her fingers over the engraving. "To James Newcomb, with gratitude for 20 years of faithful service. The First National Bank of Boston, 1855. Her father had been so proud of that watch, a symbol of his rise from clerk to trusted manager. How ironic that the very institution that had honored him would later be his downfall. When discrepancies appeared in the accounts he supervised, James Newcomb had been accused of embezzlement. He'd maintained his innocence, pointing to his assistant, Vernon Blackwood, but the evidence had seemed overwhelming. Disgraced, facing prison, James had taken his own life, or so it appeared. Delilah knew better. The night of the fire, she'd overheard her father arguing with Blackwood, who had finally admitted to stealing the money but threatened to ensure James took the blame. When the fire started shortly after Blackwood left, Delilah had been certain it was no accident. She'd barely escaped herself, awakened by the smoke and fleeing into the night with only what she could grab. With no way to prove Blackwood's guilt and her father's innocence, and the family's assets seized to repay the missing funds, she'd had no choice but to leave Boston behind. She'd headed west, where she hoped her past couldn't follow her. The supper bell interrupted her dark memories. Hastily splashing water on her face and pinning up her hair, Delilah made her way downstairs to the dining room, where 6 other boarders were already seated around a large oak table. Mrs. Wilcox stood at the head, serving generous portions of roast chicken, potatoes, and greens. "Everyone, this is Miss Newcomb, our newest boarder," Mrs. Wilcox announced. "Miss Newcomb, meet Mr. Peterson, our telegraph operator, Miss Holloway, who teaches at the school, Mr. Green, clerk at the mercantile, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, who own the bakery, and Dr. Harris, our town physician." Delilah nodded politely at each introduction, noting the curious glances. In a small town like Laramie, a new arrival was clearly an event worthy of interest. "Where are you from, Miss Newcomb?" Miss Holloway asked as Delilah took her seat. The schoolteacher was perhaps 30, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Back east," Delilah replied vaguely, unwilling to be specific. "What brings you to Laramie?" Mr. Green inquired. He was younger than the others, perhaps 25, with an eager expression. "A fresh start," Delilah said simply, hoping to discourage further questions. "Dr. Harris," an older gentleman with a neatly trimmed white beard, smiled sympathetically. "Many of us came west for the same reason. You'll find Laramie a good place for beginnings." The conversation mercifully moved on to local matters, complaints about the dry weather, speculation about when the new church would be completed, gossip about the mayor's daughter who had eloped with a cavalry lieutenant. Delilah ate quietly, savoring the simple but plentiful food after weeks of deprivation. "I saw Sheriff Vaughn escorting you here," Mrs. Parker commented during a lull. "He's a good man, our sheriff. Lost his wife in childbirth some years back. The baby, too. Never remarried." "A terrible shame," Mrs. Wilcox added. "He throws himself into his work instead. Been sheriff going on 15 years now." Delilah nodded, uncomfortable with discussing the man who had shown her kindness. "He seems very dedicated to the town." "Oh, he is," Dr. Harris confirmed. "Turned down an offer to run for territorial office last year. Said Laramie needed him more than Cheyenne did." After supper, Delilah excused herself, claiming fatigue from her journey. Back in her room, she opened her journal and recorded the day's events, ending with a reflection on the sheriff's unexpected kindness. He said, "We heal," as if healing were as inevitable as sunrise. "I'm not certain I believe that. Some wounds may be too deep, some losses too great. But I admit, it was the first time in months I've felt something besides fear and anger." Perhaps that's a start. The following morning, after a breakfast of porridge and strong coffee, Mrs. Wilcox showed Delilah to the wash-house behind the boarding house. "Mondays and Thursdays are laundry days," she explained. "Linens on Mondays, boarders' personal items on Thursdays. The rest of the week you'll help with mending." Delilah nodded, rolling up her sleeves. The work was hard, hauling water, building fires to heat it, scrubbing sheets against washboards, wringing them out, and hanging them to dry, but there was satisfaction in the clean, fresh scent and the sight of white linens billowing on the line. By mid-afternoon, the laundry was done and Mrs. Wilcox grudgingly approved of Delilah's work. "You've done this before," she observed. "Not professionally," Delilah admitted, "but I helped our housekeeper on occasion." The memory of their loyal housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, who had been with the family for 20 years, brought a pang of sadness. She too had lost her position when the Newcomb household dissolved. "Housekeeper," Mrs. Wilcox raised an eyebrow. "You come from money then?" Delilah stiffened. "We were comfortable once. Circumstances change." Mrs. Wilcox studied her for a moment, then nodded. "That they do, girl, that they do. Well, you're free until supper. Might want to look for additional work if you need pocket money. The mercantile sometimes needs help." Taking the suggestion, Delilah walked to the general store where Mr. Blake, the proprietor, listened to her inquiry with interest. "Can you cipher?" he asked, eyeing her educated speech and bearing. "Yes, sir. I'm proficient in mathematics and bookkeeping." It had been one of the skills her father had insisted she learn, unusual though it was for a young woman of her station. "I could use someone to help with the accounts 1 or 2 afternoons a week. My eyes aren't what they used to be." He named a sum that was modest but fair. "Come by Wednesday afternoon if you're interested." Pleased with securing additional income, Delilah continued down the main street, familiarizing herself with Laramie. The town was busier than she'd noticed the previous day, with wagons and riders moving through, bringing goods and news from outlying ranches and distant cities. As she passed the sheriff's office, the door opened and Daniel Vaughn emerged. He spotted her immediately, his face lighting with recognition. "Miss Newcomb, settled in at Wilcox's, I trust?" "Yes, thank you." She paused, suddenly aware of how much she owed him. "Sheriff Daniel, I never properly thanked you for your kindness yesterday. I was not at my best." His blue eyes crinkled at the corners. "No thanks needed. How are you feeling today?" "Much improved. I've arranged to help Mrs. Wilcox with laundry and mending in exchange for reduced lodging rates, and Mr. Blake at the mercantile has offered me bookkeeping work." Daniel nodded approvingly. "Blake's fair. He'll treat you well." He hesitated, then added, "I meant what I said about Sunday soup." "Tomorrow, if you've a mind to, tomorrow." The invitation caught Delilah off guard. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition. 1 o'clock if you're free." His tone was casual, but something in his eyes, a flicker of hope, perhaps made declining difficult. "All right. Thank you. I'll bring bread." It was the least she could do. Daniel smiled, transforming his serious face. "Looking forward to it." He tipped his hat and continued on his way, leaving Delilah with the unsettling realization that she was looking forward to it too. Sunday dawned clear and bright, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the approach of autumn. Delilah attended the morning church service with Mrs. Wilcox and several other boarders, listening to Reverend Collins preach about the prodigal son. The message of forgiveness and new beginnings resonated with her, though she wasn't sure she could ever forgive those who had destroyed her father and their family name. After church, she returned to the boarding house to change into her best dress, a navy blue cotton with white piping, and to retrieve the bread she'd purchased from the Parker's bakery that morning. At precisely 1 o'clock, she stood outside the sheriff's office, surprised to find herself nervous. Daniel answered her knock promptly, and Delilah was struck by the transformation of both the man and the office. Gone was the dusty lawman of 2 days ago. In his place stood Daniel Vaughn in a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. The office itself had been tidied, with a small table set for 2 in the corner farthest from the cells. "You came," he said, a smile warming his features. "I'm glad." "I brought bread," Delilah replied, holding out the paper-wrapped loaf. "As promised." Daniel accepted it with a nod. Perfect with the soup. Come in, please. The savory aroma of beef and vegetables filled the office, reminding Delilah of their first meeting. Daniel ladled the steaming soup into 2 bowls and gestured for her to sit. "You always cook in your office?" she asked as they began eating. Daniel chuckled. "Only on Sundays. I live above Henson's gunsmith shop, not much of a kitchen there. Sheriff before me installed that stove. Said a lawman needed coffee at all hours. It seems you've put it to better use." Delilah sampled the soup, finding it as delicious as she remembered. "This is wonderful. Did your mother teach you to cook?" A shadow crossed his face. "She started to. Died when I was 14. Typhoid. Pa never remarried, so I had to learn fast or starve." He smiled ruefully. "Made some terrible meals before I got the hang of it." "I'm sorry about your mother," Delilah said softly. Daniel shrugged. "Long time ago now. Pa followed her 5 years later, kicked by a horse he was shoeing. He was the blacksmith here." "So you became sheriff after that?" "Not right away. Tried my hand at ranching first, then scouting for the army. Finally came back to Laramie and found my place keeping the peace." He broke off a piece of bread. "What about you? What did you do back east?" Delilah tensed, uncertain how much to reveal. "My father was in banking," she said carefully. "I helped with his correspondence occasionally." "Banking," Daniel repeated, studying her with those perceptive blue eyes. "Long way from Wyoming territory." "Yes," she agreed, offering nothing more. To her relief, Daniel didn't press. Instead, he asked, "How are you finding Laramie so far?" "It's different, smaller, more open in every sense." She searched for words to describe the contrast with Boston's crowded, class-conscious society. "People seem to judge less on where you came from and more on what you do now." "That's the frontier for you," Daniel agreed. "Out here, what matters is if you're honest, if you work hard, if you help your neighbors when they need it. Past is past." "Is it really that simple?" Delilah couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "Not always," Daniel admitted. "People bring their prejudices west same as their furniture. But there's more chance to start fresh here than back east, I reckon." They ate in comfortable silence for a moment before Daniel asked, "Will you stay in Laramie? Or is this just a stop on your journey?" It was a question Delilah had asked herself repeatedly. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I hadn't planned beyond getting as far from Boston as my money would take me." Daniel nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Well, no need to decide today. See how the work with Blake goes. Get to know the town. And if I decide to stay, then Laramie will be the better for it," he said simply. Something warm unfurled in Delilah's chest at his words, the first genuine welcome she'd felt since leaving Boston. They finished their meal talking of safer things: the upcoming harvest festival, the new schoolhouse being built, the latest shipment of books for the small lending library run by the minister's wife. After they'd washed and dried the dishes together, a domestic task that felt strangely comfortable, Delilah prepared to take her leave. "Thank you for the meal. It was nice to have company." "It was," Daniel agreed. He hesitated, then added, "I check on the outlying homesteads once a month. Riding out tomorrow to the North properties. There's a widow, Mrs. Chen, who lost her husband last winter. She's got 3 young children and a small vegetable farm. I usually bring supplies. If you'd like to come along, I could use the help." Delilah blinked in surprise. "You want me to accompany you, if you're willing." "Mrs. Chen doesn't speak much English. Her children do, but they're shy with me. Thought a woman's presence might help." It was a reasonable explanation, but Delilah suspected there was more to the invitation. Still, the prospect of seeing more of the territory appealed to her. "I'd be happy to help. What time will you leave?" 8 o'clock. "I'll meet you at Wilcox's. Wear something comfortable for riding. It's about 2 hours each way. As Delilah walked back to the boarding house, she reflected on the unexpected turn her day had taken. She'd come to Laramie intending to hide, to nurse her wounds in solitude, yet here she was, sharing meals with the sheriff and agreeing to accompany him on his rounds. It wasn't what she'd planned, but she couldn't deny the small spark of interest Daniel Vaughn had kindled not just in him as a man, but in the possibility of a life here. The next morning dawned with the promise of heat, but the early hours were still cool when Delilah met Daniel outside the boarding house. He led 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding and a steady-looking bay mare. "This is Penny," he said, patting the mare's neck. "Gentlest horse in the livery." "You ride much, some," Delilah admitted, "though not recently." In fact, it had been years since she'd ridden in Boston's public garden and never on the open trails of Wyoming. Daniel helped her mount, his hands strong and respectful at her waist as he boosted her into the saddle. He'd secured saddlebags bulging with supplies to both horses. "What are we bringing Mrs. Chen?" Delilah asked as they rode north out of town, the buildings quickly giving way to open prairie dotted with sagebrush. "Coffee, sugar, salt, some fabric misses." "Wilcox donated, seeds for next spring's planting," Daniel replied. "And a primer for the oldest boy. Reverend Collins's wife is teaching him to read English." Delilah was touched by these thoughtful provisions. How did Mrs. Chen and her husband come to settle here? It seemed an unlikely place for a Chinese family. "Railroad," Daniel explained. "Mr. Chen Lai was his name, worked laying track, got injured and couldn't continue. They'd saved enough to buy a small plot north of town, started growing vegetables to sell to the railroad crews and townspeople. Good people, hardworking, and no one minded them settling here." Delilah knew how Chinese workers were often treated in the West. Daniel's expression darkened. "Some did. There was trouble at first, harassment, vandalism. I made it clear that wouldn't be tolerated in my jurisdiction. Eventually, folks came to respect Lai's work ethic. After he died pneumonia last winter, the community helped the family get through." They rode in companionable silence, the vast Wyoming landscape unfolding around them. After months in crowded cities and on cramped stagecoaches, Delilah found the open space both terrifying and exhilarating. The enormous sky, the distant mountains, the rolling prairie stretching to the horizon, it made her feel small, but somehow free. "It's beautiful," she said at last. "In a way I hadn't expected." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Different kind of beauty than back east, I imagine. Takes some getting used to all this space. But once it gets in your blood, nowhere else feels quite right." 2 hours later they crested a small rise, and Daniel pointed to a modest homestead nestled in a protected hollow. A small house, a vegetable garden, a chicken coop, and a lean-to stable made up the Chen farm. As they approached, 3 small children emerged from the house, followed by a petite woman with her hair pulled back in a simple knot. Daniel dismounted and helped Delilah down, then called a greeting. The children hung back shyly until their mother spoke to them in Chinese, gesturing toward the visitors. The oldest, a boy of about 9, stepped forward. "Hello, Sheriff Vaughn," he said carefully. "Thank you for coming." "Hello, Michael," Daniel replied, using the American name the boy had adopted. "This is Miss Newcomb. She's new to Laramie." Delilah smiled at the children. "Hello, what are your names?" The middle child, a girl of perhaps 7, whispered, "I'm Grace." The youngest, a boy of about 5, hid behind his sister. Mrs. Chen bowed slightly to Delilah, then spoke to Michael, who translated. "My mother welcomes you and thanks you for coming so far." "Tell her it's my pleasure," Delilah replied, touched by the formal greeting. While Daniel unloaded the supplies and spoke with Mrs. Chen through Michael's translation, Delilah found herself drawn to the garden, where neat rows of vegetables flourished despite the challenging climate. Grace followed her, watching curiously. "These are beautiful," Delilah said, gesturing to the thriving plants. "Does your mother grow all of these?" Grace nodded. "We help Michael and me, not Robbie yet, he's too little." "You do a wonderful job. You sell these in town." "Mr. Blake comes every week with his wagon," Grace explained. "Takes vegetables to the store." She pointed to a section of smaller plants. "These are herbs for medicine. Mama knows which ones help when you're sick." Delilah was impressed by the family's industriousness and knowledge. As the morning progressed, she helped Mrs. Chen in the garden while Daniel repaired a leak in the roof and checked the stability of the lean-to. The children gradually warmed to Delilah, especially after she showed Grace how to make a simple doll from scraps of the fabric they'd brought. At midday, Mrs. Chen insisted they stay for a meal, serving a flavorful soup with vegetables from the garden and dumplings that she showed Delilah how to make. Despite the language barrier, the two women communicated through gestures, smiles, and occasionally Michael's translation. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Chen pressed a small cloth bundle into Delilah's hands. Opening it, she found dried herbs tied with string. "For tea," Michael explained. "Mama says it helps when you're sad. She says your eyes look sad sometimes." Delilah's throat tightened at the perceptive observation. "Thank your mother for me," she said, carefully rewrapping the herbs. "Tell her this is very kind." On the ride back to Laramie, Delilah was quieter, reflecting on the day. The Chen family had lost so much their homeland than Mr. Chen, yet they carried on with dignity and purpose. "They're remarkable," she said finally. "To endure such hardship and still be so generous." Daniel nodded. "Mrs. Chen says everyone has something to give, no matter how little they have." Hard to argue with that wisdom. "She noticed I was sad," Delilah said softly. "Are you?" Daniel asked, his voice gentle. "Sad?" Delilah looked out over the prairie, considering how to answer. "I'm angry, hurt, lost." She hesitated. "Yes, sad too." Daniel didn't immediately respond, giving her words the respect of his silence. Finally, he said, "Whatever happened back east, whatever drove you here, it doesn't define you, not unless you let it." "Easy to say," Delilah replied, unable to keep an edge from her voice. "You don't know what I've lost." "No," he agreed, "I don't, but I know lost, Delilah, different from yours, but real all the same." The use of her first name, the honesty in his voice, both disarmed her defenses. "Your wife," she said softly. "Mrs. Parker mentioned at supper. I'm sorry." Daniel's hands tightened on the reins briefly before relaxing. "Rebecca. We'd been married just over a year. The baby was a boy. Would have named him after my father, William." His voice was steady, but Delilah could hear the old pain beneath the words. "For a while after, I didn't think I'd survive it, didn't much care if I did." "What changed?" He considered the question seriously. "Time, work. The town needed a sheriff. People needed me to function, so I did, even when I didn't want to, and gradually the pain. It didn't go away, but it changed, became something I could carry without being crushed by it." They rode in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. As Laramie came into view, Daniel spoke again. "The soup invitation stands. Every Sunday. No obligation." Delilah looked at his profile, struck by the quiet strength there. "Thank you. I'd like that." Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged in Delilah's new life. Mondays and Thursdays were spent helping Mrs. Wilcox with laundry. Wednesdays and Saturdays, she worked at Blake's Mercantile, managing the accounts with an efficiency that impressed the proprietor enough to increase her hours. The rest of her time was divided between mending for the boarding house residents, attending church on Sundays, and helping with community events. And every Sunday afternoon, she shared soup with Sheriff Daniel Vaughn. These meals became the highlight of Delilah's week. Daniel was an excellent listener, never pushing but always interested. Gradually, she shared more of herself, her love of literature, her childhood dream of becoming a teacher, her mother's death from influenza when Delilah was 16. She spoke of her father's dedication to his work and his principles, though she carefully avoided mentioning the scandal that had destroyed him. In turn, Daniel told her about growing up in Laramie, his brief time ranching. Cattle have minds of their own, and they're rarely brilliant minds. His years scouting for the Army, and his return to become sheriff after the previous lawman retired. He spoke of his parents with affection and respect, and occasionally of Rebecca, always with a gentle sadness that time had softened but never erased. As September gave way to October, Delilah realized she had begun to think of Laramie as home. She had friends now, Miss Holloway from the boarding house, who shared her love of books, Dr. Harris, who engaged her in thoughtful conversations about everything from politics to poetry, Mrs. Chen and her children, whom she visited regularly, learning to make dumplings and teaching Grace simple needlework in return. And then there was Daniel. She wasn't sure when her feelings for him had deepened from gratitude to friendship to something more complicated. Perhaps it was the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at her across the table. Perhaps it was his unfailing kindness, not just to her but to everyone in his care, from the Chen family to the occasional drunk he locked up overnight for his own safety. Perhaps it was simply that in his presence, she felt both safer and more alive than she had since before her father's death. Whatever the cause, Delilah found herself looking forward to their time together with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. She hadn't come to Laramie looking for attachment. She'd come to escape, to hide, to lick her wounds in private. Yet here she was, setting her heart at risk once again. The town's harvest festival in mid-October marked a turning point. Laramie's main street had been transformed with decorations of autumn leaves and corn husks. Tables laden with food lined the boardwalks, while musicians played on a makeshift stage near the livery stable. Children ran laughing between games of skill and chance, and adults greeted neighbors and friends with the warm camaraderie of a community celebrating abundance before winter's arrival. Delilah had helped Mrs. Wilcox prepare pies for the occasion, and now stood watching the festivities with a sense of belonging she hadn't expected to feel so soon. Miss Holloway joined her, offering a cup of hot cider. "Quite the celebration," the schoolteacher commented. "Have you ever seen the like back east?" "Similar but different," Delilah replied. "More formal affairs usually. This has a wonderful spirit to it." Miss Holloway smiled knowingly. "Speaking of spirits, I believe Sheriff Vaughn is looking for you. He's been glancing this way for the past 10 minutes. Delilah felt a blush rise to her cheeks as she spotted Daniel across the street, handsome in a clean shirt and vest, his sheriff's badge gleaming in the autumn sunlight. He caught her eye and made his way toward her through the crowd. "Miss Newcomb," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "Miss Holloway." "Enjoying the festivities?" "Very much," Miss Holloway replied with a smile that suggested she knew exactly what was developing between Delilah and the sheriff. "If you'll excuse me, I promised to help Judge Wilson with the children's games." As she departed, Daniel turned to Delilah. "Would you care to walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you." Curious, Delilah nodded, and they strolled away from the busiest part of the celebration toward the edge of town. Daniel seemed uncharacteristically nervous, clearing his throat several times before speaking. "I've been thinking," he began. "About your situation." Delilah tensed. Had someone from Boston written to inquire about her? Had her past finally caught up with her? What about my situation? Your room at Wilcox's, it's fine for temporary lodging, but it's small. And Mrs. Wilcox, while fair, can be particular. This wasn't what Delilah had expected. She has been very kind to me, she said carefully. Of course, Daniel agreed hastily. But I thought that is, if you're planning to stay in Laramie, you might want something more permanent. They had reached a small house at the edge of town, a neat white clapboard structure with blue shutters and a small front porch. A for sale sign stood in the yard. Old Mrs. Henderson passed last month, Daniel explained. Her son in Denver is selling the house. It's not large, but it's solid. 2 bedrooms, kitchen, parlor, good well out back, small garden. Delilah stared at the house, then at Daniel. Are you suggesting I buy it or rent it? He said. The son would consider either. I know your position at Blake's is going well, and Mrs. Wilcox says you've become indispensable with the mending. Daniel, Delilah said gently, I appreciate your thinking of me, but I can't afford a house. Not yet. He nodded, disappointment flickering across his features. I understand. It was just a thought. I know how much you value your independence. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the little house with its welcoming porch and neat yard. Delilah tried to imagine herself living there, having a real home again after months of transience. The image was unexpectedly appealing. Perhaps someday, she said finally, if I continue to save. Daniel hesitated, then spoke in a rush. There's another possibility. The house has 2 bedrooms. You could take in a boarder to help with the cost. A boarder? Who? She stopped as understanding dawned. You. The tips of his ears reddened. It would be a proper arrangement. Separate rooms. I'd pay fair rent. It's just my room above the gunsmith is barely large enough for a bed and bureau, and with winter coming. He trailed off, looking embarrassed. Delilah's mind raced. The suggestion was highly improper by Boston standards, an unmarried woman sharing a house with a man, even one as respected as the sheriff. Yet frontier towns had different rules, born of necessity and practicality. People would talk, she said, testing his reaction. Some would, he admitted. But most folks in Laramie mind their own business, and those who know me know I'd never. He cleared his throat again. That is, your reputation would be safe with me. The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. I know that, she said softly. I trust you, Daniel. His eyes lit with something that might have been hope. Then you'll consider it. I'll think about it, she promised. But I need to be practical. Even with a boarder, the cost might be beyond my means right now. He nodded, understanding in his gaze. Of course. No rush to decide. The house isn't going anywhere. He offered his arm. Shall we return to the festival? I hear Mrs. Parker has made her famous apple dumplings. As they walked back toward the celebration, Delilah found herself imagining a life in that little house, a place of her own again, with Daniel as her boarder. The idea should have scandalized her, but instead it filled her with a warm anticipation that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the man beside her. The following Tuesday, as Delilah was finishing her work at Blake's Mercantile, a telegram arrived that shattered her growing sense of security. Mr. Blake handed it to her with a curious expression. Just came in, he said. Addressed to you. Peterson brought it over himself. Delilah stared at the yellow paper, her heart pounding. No one knew she was in Laramie. No one from her past had this address. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the telegram and read. Miss Delilah Newcomb, stop information, received you residing Laramie, Wyoming. Stop evidence, discovered proving your father's innocence. Stop Blackwood, arrested, confession, obtained. Stop family assets, being released. Stop, please contact First National Bank, Boston, at earliest convenience. Stop sincere regrets for your loss and suffering. Stop Harrison. Wells President. The paper fluttered from her numb fingers to the counter. Mr. Blake picked it up, glanced at it, and looked at her with new respect. Seems like important news, Miss Newcomb. Yes, she whispered, her mind reeling. Very important. Bad news? He asked, concern evident in his voice. No, good news, very good news. She took a deep breath. Mr. Blake, I need to send a reply, and then, I think I need to sit down. Of course, he said, gesturing to the chair behind the counter. Take all the time you need. Delilah composed a brief reply confirming her location and requesting further information, then sat in stunned silence, processing the implications. Her father had been innocent, just as she'd always believed. Vernon Blackwood had confessed. The family assets, which included a substantial amount in investments and property, were being released. She was no longer destitute, no longer in hiding, no longer the daughter of a disgraced banker. The bell above the door jingled, and Daniel walked in, his expression brightening when he saw her. Delilah, I was hoping to catch you before you returned to Wilcox's. There's a matter I wanted to discuss. He stopped, noticing her pale face. What's wrong? Has something happened? Wordlessly, she handed him the telegram. He read it quickly, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the information. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. This is significant news, he said carefully. Yes, she searched his face, trying to gauge his reaction. It changes everything. Does it? His voice was neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or fear. Will you be returning to Boston then? The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Delilah realized with sudden clarity that she didn't want to leave Laramie, didn't want to leave Daniel. I don't know, she answered honestly. I need to reply to learn more details. But Daniel, this means. She hesitated, aware of Mr. Blake's interested presence. Could we discuss this somewhere more private? Daniel nodded immediately. My office, or we could walk. A walk, I think. I need the air. Outside, the late October sun cast long shadows across Laramie's Main Street. They walked in silence until they reached the edge of town, where the prairie stretched away to the distant mountains. My father was innocent, Delilah said finally. I always believed it, but now everyone will know. His name will be cleared. I'm glad, Daniel said sincerely. For his sake and yours. You've carried that burden a long time, and the family assets being released, I won't have to struggle financially anymore. She looked at him directly. That house we looked at, I could buy it outright now. A shadow crossed his face. I see. No, I don't think you do, Delilah said, suddenly bold. I could buy it outright and I wouldn't need a boarder to help with the cost, but I find I still want one. She held his gaze steadily. A very specific one. Daniel's expression transformed from guarded to hopeful. Delilah, I came to Laramie with nothing, Daniel, nothing but grief and anger and fear. I didn't want connections. I didn't want to trust anyone. And then you fed me soup and told me we heal. Her voice caught on the memory. And somehow, because of you, because of this place, I have. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Are you saying you want to stay in Laramie? I'm saying I've found something here I never expected to find again. A home. A community. She took a deep breath. Someone I care for deeply. Daniel reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. Since that first day when you nearly collapsed on my doorstep, I've felt drawn to you in a way I haven't felt toward anyone since Rebecca. It scared me at first. I wasn't looking to feel that way again. Nor was I, Delilah admitted. After everything that happened with my father, I was determined never to be vulnerable again, never to trust. And now, his question was barely audible, filled with hope and fear in equal measure. Now I find that some risks are worth taking. She squeezed his hand. I don't know exactly what this means for my future. I'll need to correspond with the bank, perhaps even travel to Boston eventually to settle affairs. But Daniel, I want my home to be here, with you." The joy that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Delilah Newcomb," he said, his voice rich with emotion. "I believe I've been falling in love with you since the moment you sat at my table and called my soup delicious." Her heart soared at his words. "And I with you, though I fought it every step of the way." "You're stubborn that way," he said with a tender smile. "One of the many things I love about you." The word love hung in the air between them, precious and new. Daniel stepped closer, his free hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Delilah?" "Yes," she whispered, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with promise, the promise of healing, of home, of a future neither had expected to find. When they finally parted, Delilah felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, as if the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. "So," Daniel said, his eyes twinkling, "about that house." Delilah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I think we should look at it together. Properly this time." They walked back toward town hand in hand, discussing practical matters, the house, her correspondence with the bank, how to handle the inevitable gossip when Sheriff Vaughn began courting Miss Newcomb openly. Yet beneath these everyday concerns flowed a current of joy and anticipation, the sense that something precious had been found amid the wreckage of their separate sorrows. 3 days later, a second telegram arrived, providing more details about Vernon Blackwood's arrest and confession. He had embezzled funds, framed James Newcomb, and most damning of all, admitted to setting the fire that had claimed James's life, intending to destroy evidence that might have exonerated him. The telegram confirmed that Delilah's inheritance was substantial, more than enough to purchase the Henderson house and establish herself comfortably in Laramie, with plenty remaining for future security. The news of Delilah's changed circumstances and her blossoming relationship with Daniel spread through Laramie with the efficiency of a small town's grapevine. To her surprise, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. "About time that man found someone," Mrs. Wilcox declared when Delilah gave notice that she would be moving to her own house. "Rebecca would have approved of you, I think. Strong-minded but kind-hearted." Dr. Harris smiled warmly when he encountered them walking together. "The healing power of human connection never ceases to amaze me," he said. "I'm happy for you both." Even Reverend Collins, after an initial concern about proprieties, gave his blessing. "God works in mysterious ways," he told them after Sunday service. "Sometimes the longest road leads us exactly where we need to be." By Thanksgiving, Delilah had moved into the Henderson house, which she had purchased outright. Daniel continued to live above the gunsmith shop for propriety's sake, though he spent most evenings with her, sharing meals and conversation on her cozy front porch or by the fire in her small parlor. Their courtship progressed with the steady assurance of two people who had already weathered significant storms and found strength in each other. They spoke openly of a future together, though both agreed there was no need to rush. Delilah still needed to resolve her affairs in Boston, and Daniel was determined to court her properly, with the respect she deserved. As December arrived, bringing the first heavy snows of winter, Delilah received a letter from Mr. Harrison Wells, the bank president, requesting her presence in Boston after the new year to finalize the legal matters regarding her inheritance. The prospect of returning east filled her with mixed emotions. Closure was necessary, but Boston held painful memories, and leaving Daniel, even temporarily, would be difficult. "I'll go with you," Daniel offered as they discussed the letter over dinner in her kitchen. if you'd like the company." Delilah looked at him across the table, touched by the offer. "You'd leave Laramie. Who would keep the peace?" "Deputy Miller is capable enough for a few weeks," Daniel said. "And I've never seen the East. Might be educational." She smiled at his attempt at casualness. "You just don't want to let me out of your sight. Afraid I'll be seduced by Boston society and never return." His expression grew serious. "No. I know where your heart is now, but facing those memories won't be easy. You shouldn't have to do it alone." Delilah reached across the table to take his hand. "Thank you. Having you there would make it easier." She paused, considering, "But there's something else we should discuss before making such plans." Daniel raised an eyebrow questioningly. "If you accompany me to Boston, people will talk even more than they already do. They'll expect." She hesitated, feeling uncharacteristically shy. "An engagement," Daniel finished for her, "or even marriage." "Yes." She met his gaze steadily. "Is that something you're ready to consider?" "Because I am." The look that crossed Daniel's face was one of pure joy, quickly followed by a more measured expression. "Delilah, I've been ready since that day at the Harvest Festival, but I didn't want to rush you." "Daniel Vaughn," she said softly, "I've had my life upended enough times to know when something is right. This us is right." He rose from his chair and came around the table, kneeling beside her. Taking both her hands in his, he looked up with eyes filled with love. "I don't have a ring yet," he said. "I was planning to speak to the jeweler in Cheyenne next week, but I can't wait another moment. Delilah Newcomb, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of happiness filled her eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." He stood, pulling her up into his embrace, and kissed her with a passion that spoke of long, restrained emotion finally given freedom. When they parted, both breathless, he pressed his forehead against hers. "I love you," he murmured. "More than I thought possible after Rebecca." "Different, but just as true." "And I love you," she replied. "You healed me, Daniel, just as you said we would." Their wedding took place on Christmas Eve in Laramie's small church, decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the season. The entire town seemed to attend, crowding into the pews to witness Sheriff Daniel Vaughn and Miss Delilah Newcomb exchange vows before Reverend Collins. Delilah wore a gown of deep blue silk, a splurge ordered from Denver, with some of her restored funds, with her mother's locket at her throat and a simple gold band, Daniel's gift, on her finger. Daniel looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new black suit, his badge polished for the occasion. After the ceremony, the community celebrated with a feast at the Wilcox boarding house, which Mrs. Wilcox had insisted on hosting. "Never thought I'd see the day," the landlady said, wiping a suspicious moisture from her eye as she embraced Delilah. "You're good for him. Both of you deserve this happiness." Mrs. Chen and her children attended as well, bringing vegetables preserved from their summer garden and dumplings that had become a town favorite. Michael, now more confident in his English, gave a small speech thanking the sheriff and his new wife for their kindness to his family. As the evening progressed, Daniel found a moment to pull Delilah aside into the quiet of Mrs. Wilcox's parlor. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "A wedding gift." He handed her a small box. Inside lay a delicate silver chain with a pendant shaped like a bowl. Delilah looked at him questioningly. "To remember our beginning," he explained. "Soup and healing." Tears filled her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Help me put it on." As he fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin, Delilah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of despair in Boston to the promise of a new life in Laramie, with a man who had taught her that healing was not just possible, but inevitable when hearts opened to one another. They traveled to Boston in January, staying for 3 weeks to settle Delilah's affairs. The city was, as she remembered, elegant, sophisticated, cold in more ways than one. Daniel observed the society that had been her world with curiosity and occasional amusement, but never judgment. They visited her father's grave, now marked with a new headstone that recognized James Newcomb as a man of honor, vindicated in death. They met with Mr. Wells at the bank, who formally apologized for the institution's role in her father's tragic end and transferred control of her assets to her and her new husband. And they visited the site of her childhood home, now an empty lot awaiting new construction. Standing there in the snow, Delilah felt the last of her anger dissolve, replaced by a sense of closure. "Ready to go home?" Daniel asked as they turned away from the past. "Yes," she said simply, "to our home." Spring came early to Wyoming territory that year. By March, the prairie was showing the first hints of green, and Delilah's garden at the Henderson house, now the Vaughn house, was ready for planting. With advice from Mrs. Chen, she had ambitious plans for vegetables and flowers, transforming the small yard into a place of beauty and sustenance. Daniel continued his work as sheriff, now returning each evening to a home filled with warmth and love. Delilah divided her time between maintaining their household, helping with the bookkeeping at Blake's Mercantile, now more as a favor than a necessity, and establishing a small lending library in one corner of their front parlor, open to any resident of Laramie who wished to borrow a book. In April, Delilah made a special soup, Daniel's recipe, with a few improvements of her own, and set the table with their best dishes. When he returned from his rounds, she was waiting with news of her own. "A baby," he repeated after she told him, his expression transforming from shock to wonder. "We're having a baby in November," she confirmed, watching joy spread across his beloved face. "Dr. Harris confirmed it yesterday." Daniel gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious porcelain. "A family," he murmured into her hair. "Our family." "Yes," Delilah agreed, feeling the rightness of it settle in her bones. "Our family." Later that evening, as they sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel placed his hand gently over her still flat stomach. "When I found you that day, half-starved and ready to collapse," he said softly, "I never imagined we'd be here now. That the woman who could barely accept a bowl of soup would become my wife, the mother of my child. And I never imagined the lawman who fed me would become my heart's home," Delilah replied, covering his hand with hers. "But here we are, he agreed, healed." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Delilah Newcomb Vaughn rested her head on her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that sometimes the longest journeys lead exactly where we need to be, and that healing, once begun, continues in ways we never expected, through all the seasons of our lives. James William Vaughn was born on a snowy November evening in 1876, arriving with a robust cry that made his father weep with joy, and his mother laugh through her tears. Named for both his grandfathers, he had Daniel's blue eyes and Delilah's determined chin, a combination that promised character and strength. The town of Laramie celebrated the sheriff's son as if he belonged to them all. Mrs. Wilcox knitted blankets. Dr. Harris pronounced him the healthiest baby he'd delivered that year, and Mrs. Chen brought special tea to help Delilah recover her strength. And each Sunday, without fail, Daniel made soup a tradition that continued through the seasons and years that followed, a reminder of beginnings and healing, of hope restored, and love discovered in the most unexpected of places. In the spring of 1880, when James was 3 and his sister Elizabeth Rebecca was 1. Delilah stood in the doorway of their expanded home now with a proper dining room and a study lined with books, watching Daniel tell stories to their children in the front yard. The sound of their laughter carried on the Wyoming breeze, sweeter than any music. She touched the small silver pendant that still hung around her neck, the bowl that symbolized their beginning. From that first meal shared in his office to the family gathered around their table each night, soup and healing remained at the heart of their story. "Mama," James called, spotting her. "Come see what Papa taught me." Delilah stepped into the sunshine, moving toward the family that had blossomed from despair and kindness, from loss and hope, from a simple meal shared between strangers who would become everything to each other. "This," she thought as Daniel reached for her hand, pulling her into their circle of love, "this is what it means to be truly healed."